You know, it's getting harder and harder lately to shake this feeling that the foundations of American democracy
Mm-hmm.
are, well, they feel pretty shaky, don't they?
Hmm.
You just look around at the politics, all the arguing, the divisions. It doesn't feel like a coherent system anymore. It's more like, I don't know, puzzle pieces that just don't fit together.
Yeah, that sense of unease is very real, and I think it reflects this um, complex mix of some really significant trends we're seeing right now.
Okay, so for this deep dive, we've managed to pull together well, a really compelling set of sources that try to make sense of all this.
Right.
We've got an expert interview. It really digs into how education levels seem to be shaping our political divides.
Yeah, that's a fascinating one.
And then there's this NPR series exploring how people actually think about and, experience free speech today, which seems to be shifting.
Mm.
Plus, some really hard-hitting analysis of all the disinformation that was flying around during the 2024 election.
Huge factor.
And finally, this really thought-provoking essay on, well, basically why free speech is absolutely vital for democracy to even work.
Exactly. So it's definitely a multifaceted picture we're trying to build. The goal here, really, is to connect the dots between these different things: the polarization, free expression, the health of our democratic institutions.
And try to pull out the key insights, right? Understand what's really going on.
That's the plan.
So where do we even start trying to untangle this? I mean, the thing that jumped out at me right away was this idea of the diploma divide. It seems like it might be driving so much of the friction we see politically.
I think that's a critical place to start, actually. There's the work of Matt Grossman, a political scientist at MSU, especially his book Polarized by Degrees. It offers a really insightful take on this.
What?
He basically argues that this growing separation, educationally speaking, between the Democrats and Republicans is like a fundamental driver of the polarization we're experiencing.
He talks about this really dramatic shift in the Democratic Party, doesn't he? Like
Uh-huh.
back in the early 90s, most of their voters were white folks without a college degree.
Right. A clear majority.
And now that group is, what, less than a quarter of their base?
Yeah.
That just seems like a massive change.
It really is. And what's just as significant, as Grossman points out, is that the Republican Party's base has pretty much stayed dominated by white voters without a four-year college degree.
Right.
And this divergence, this difference in educational backgrounds, it seems to correlate with some really different views on, who to trust and how society ought to function.
Like how Democrats seem to be looking more towards credentialed experts to shape policy.
Yeah, increasingly so.
Whereas on the Republican side, you see this real surge in populist views, right? A growing skepticism towards established authorities, teachers, scientists, journalists, universities, the whole lot, really.
It's pretty widespread skepticism. And what's fascinating is how this diploma divide might also shape how different groups even interpret information, or what they see as, acceptable things to say.
How so?
Well, for instance, if you value expert opinion differently based on your education level, that might lead to really contrasting views on what counts as harmful misinformation.
Ah, okay, so that affects what speech maybe should be restricted.
Potentially, yeah. And it's not just about disagreements on policy anymore. It kind of feeds right into the culture wars. It makes it much harder for institutions, universities, the media, whatever, to be seen as, objective or neutral.
And it doesn't sound like something that's easy to just reverse. Grossman also mentions how our, really entrenched two-party system here in the U.S. might actually make it worse.
How does that work?
Well, political movements that might form third parties in other countries, here they tend to just pull the existing parties further towards the extremes.
Right. Sort of reinforces the divide.
Okay, so we have this deepening polarization, partly driven by education. But how does that connect with how we actually express ourselves? I guess that's where this NPR series on free speech fits in.
Exactly. Yeah, the NPR series, The State of the First Amendment, it asks a really critical question. Who feels like they're being censored now compared to, say, before President Trump came back into office? And what it shows is a really complex kind of shifting landscape of how people perceive this.
It definitely does. I mean, on one side, they reported instances of scientists feeling pressured, to scrub reports of terms the Trump administration didn't like.
That was striking.
And you had student activists who were genuinely worried about deportation if they protested certain things.
Yeah.
And then there's that history teacher, E, who felt she had to basically self-censor in her classroom because she was worried about backlash over teaching DEI topics.
And those examples, They really highlight a tangible fear, don't they? That
Mhm.
speaking out on certain issues could lead to real negative consequences affecting your job, maybe even your immigration status. And that teacher's situation, especially, it raises serious concerns about a potential chilling effect on open discussion, particularly in schools.
But then you've got the other side of it, too. The series found that some groups, like anti-abortion activists or groups like Moms for Liberty, even college Republican clubs,
Mm-hmm.
they actually felt more free, more empowered to speak out now.
Right. They quoted the president of the UC Berkeley College Republicans, Miguel Muniz, saying more students were willing to openly identify as conservative on campus.
So it's this real contrast.
It is, and it's really telling. It suggests that the feeling of being free to speak or conversely feeling silenced, it's often really tied up with your political leaning and, the political climate of the moment.
Hmm.
A change in administration can make some groups feel liberated while making others feel anxious.
And it was interesting how highly ranked free speech was for voters in the 2024 election. Republicans in particular were more likely to call it very important and also report feeling less free to speak under President Biden.
Mm-hmm.
Then, of course, you have President Trump coming back into office and immediately signing an executive order that was aimed at, quote, restoring freedom of speech.
Yeah, and that just underscores how politicized the whole idea of free speech has become, doesn't it? I mean, it's supposed to be this fundamental right for everybody, but how it's interpreted and applied often gets tangled up in partisan goals.
Right. And some critics pointed out that his concern for free speech seemed kind of selective.
That criticism definitely exists, and it reinforces the point about politicization.
Okay, so we've got deep polarization, this really contested ground around free speech. Now let's throw in the whole disinformation angle from the 2024 election. That Brookings analysis really gets into how that shaped what we were all seeing and hearing.
Absolutely. And you have to consider the environment, right? Public trust in, let's say, traditional news is already low.
Yeah, really low.
And then you have artificial intelligence making it incredibly easy to whip up convincing fake stuff,
Yep.
videos, audio, you name it. We're hearing the term deep fakes more and more. So the 2024 election just became this prime target for organized disinformation campaigns. And as the analysis points out, the goal often seemed to be eroding trust, especially in the election process itself, and just making voters feel negatively about certain candidates.
And some of the examples they cited were just, wow, pretty shocking. There was that fake video, right? They traced it back to Russia eventually, of a supposed Haitian man claiming he voted multiple times in Georgia.
Yeah, that one got a lot of traction.
And then these totally made-up stories about immigrants eating cats and dogs. I mean, really.
Crazy stuff. And the doctored photo of Kamala Harris with Jeffrey Epstein.
Ugh. And didn't they mention a false accusation against Tim Walz, too?
Yes, that was another example cited. It's almost unbelievable, the kind of stuff that circulated.
So how did this stuff spread so effectively?
Well, that's the crucial part. These weren't just, isolated posts hidden away somewhere. They got amplified across a whole range of channels.
Like social media.
Definitely social media, often as viral memes, but sometimes they even got picked up and talked about by mainstream media outlets.
Seriously?
Yeah, and then further spread by online influencers and sometimes even repeated by the candidates themselves. It's this multi-pronged attack that really boosts their reach and their impact.
And it really seemed to work, didn't it? In terms of skewing how people saw the candidates and the big issues. Like, think about immigration.
Right.
Trump kept talking about an invasion at the border. But when you actually look at the numbers, the stats, they didn't always line up with that kind of rhetoric.
Exactly. Or look at crime. The data often showed, and still shows, that native-born Americans commit crimes at higher rates than immigrants, but the narrative pushed was often the opposite.
And the economy, too. There was so much negative feeling about the economy, but in some ways, it didn't quite match up with the actual economic indicators, like job growth or GDP.
It's this combination, isn't it? A fragmented media landscape, these fake stories that really hit an emotional nerve. It creates this powerful feedback loop, and it's really hard to counter with just facts alone.
So what does the Brookings analysis say we need to do about it?
Well, they highlight a few key areas. More effective content moderation by the social media platforms, for one.
Okay.
Improving digital literacy is huge, helping people get better at spotting fake information.
Makes sense.
Also, trying to understand the psychology behind why people want to believe negative or sensational stuff. And finally, tackling the financial incentives, because sometimes people spread lies simply because it pays.
It really does paint a pretty concerning picture overall. So you've got this deep partisan split A real fight over what free speech even means anymore, and then this constant flood of disinformation muddying the waters. It just feels like it's putting immense strain on the whole system. Which brings us to that essay from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It really ties it all together, looking at how the fate of American democracy is so fundamentally linked to free speech.
Yes, Suzanne Nossel from PEN America, she makes a really powerful case in that essay. Her point is that free speech isn't just, an individual right to say what you want. It's a collective cultural value essential for a healthy democracy,
Hmm.
right alongside things like voting rights and civil rights.
And she seems really worried that this value is under attack.
Deeply concerned. She argues it's under threat from multiple directions, actually, from all sides, really.
Then she breaks down how both the left and the right seem to be, maybe in different ways, kind of losing faith in it.
Exactly. You have some on the progressive side who increasingly see free speech as like a smokescreen for hate speech or something that protects harmful ideologies.
Right, and they might want to restrict discussions on sensitive topics like, say, transgender rights or racial justice out of a fear of causing offense or harm.
hmm And it's important to distinguish here. The legal definition of hate speech in the U.S. is quite narrow, usually about inciting violence. But the concern often focuses on speech that, while maybe legal, is seen as creating a hostile environment.
Okay, and then on the conservative side.
Well, you have conservatives who are very quick to condemn what they see as ideological wokeness or conformity.
Yeah, you hear that a lot.
But then at the same time, some are actively pushing for things like book bans in schools and libraries, or curriculum restrictions, often targeting authors and themes related to minority groups or LGBTQ plus issues.
So it's like both sides are chipping away at it, but for different reasons.
That's the argument Nossel makes. This erosion of a shared commitment to free speech as a core democratic value is really worrying. If younger generations especially start to see it as problematic or, outdated, that has huge long-term consequences.
And restricting what can be taught or learned in schools, that undermines critical thinking, right?
Yeah,
Which you need for democracy to work.
absolutely. And Nossel lays out all those crucial roles that free speech plays. It allows citizens to be informed. It holds leaders accountable.
Right, it's a check on power.
It facilitates open debate, helps uncover truth, acts as a kind of safety valve for tensions.
And protects minority rights, too.
Yes, historically that's been vital. It really does sound like the bedrock, as you said.
So what are the main pressures she identifies that are straining this relationship between free speech and democracy right now?
Well, technology is a massive one. The speed at which misinformation spreads, the difficulty in countering it, how algorithms can amplify extreme content, online harassment silencing people.
Foreign interference, too.
Yes, and just the huge challenge of regulating online content without infringing on legitimate speech. That's a minefield.
No.
Increasing societal diversity is another pressure point. It leads to complex debates about, who gets to tell which stories, whether certain kinds of gatekeeping are needed, backlash against representation.
Like the debates around LGBTQ plus issues you mentioned.
Exactly. And identity politics generally can impact how speech is viewed or policed within different groups. And then, of course, there's the intense political polarization we've already talked about.
How does that specifically pressure free speech?
Well, it often leads to hypocrisy, right? Both sides might champion free speech when it suits their allies, but try to shut it down when it comes from opponents. The left might focus on harm to justify silencing certain views, while the right resorts to state power, like book bans, to combat wokeness. Political goals override consistent principle.
We're seeing these pressures have real-world consequences, aren't we? Like in education.
Definitely. There's documented self-censorship among college students. A University of Wisconsin study showed students hesitant to even consider opposing views, let alone express their own controversial ones.
And this idea of conflating feeling offended with actual harm or even violence.
That's part of the campus dynamic Nossel describes. And then you have the explosion in book bans. PEN America tracked over 6,000 instances, disproportionately hitting marginalized voices.
Plus those educational gag orders. Laws limiting teaching about race, LGBTQ plus issues.
Yeah.
Like Florida's Don't Say Gay law.
Yes, those are direct legislative actions impacting speech in the classroom. And it's not just education. We're seeing more laws limiting protest rights, too.
How so?
States are broadening definitions of rioting, increasing penalties for things like obstructing traffic during protests, targeting protests near critical infrastructure, even trying to shield drivers who hit protesters in some cases.
Wow. And we saw how universities responded to the student protests related to Gaza recently as well.
That's another complex example of navigating protest rights and campus safety. Then there's the press, the economic crisis facing local news.
The extinction crisis, some call it.
Right. That decline, combined with the rise of hyperpartisan media and the constant attacks discrediting mainstream journalism, it creates an information ecosystem where trust is just shattered.
Which brings us back to that fundamental disagreement you mentioned earlier. Who do you trust? What's reliable information? And how does that shape views on acceptable speech?
It all seems deeply interconnected, doesn't it? This polarization, fueled partly by education, this contested idea of free speech in the digital age, the weaponization of disinformation. It all puts immense pressure on our democratic institutions.
It really does feel all tied together.
And what these sources collectively suggest, I think, is that there are no simple fixes here. Addressing these challenges, it's going to require a really multifaceted approach. Things like promoting media literacy, fostering critical thinking skills.
And maybe a renewed commitment across the board to the actual principles of free expression, even when it's speech we don't like.
That seems crucial, even when it's uncomfortable or challenges our own deepest beliefs.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, it really leaves you, the listener, with a pretty profound question, I think. When you consider all these interconnected trends we've talked about, what is the responsibility of each of us, as individual citizens? How do we safeguard both free expression and the foundations of a healthy democracy in this, well, this incredibly polarized, information-swamped world we live in?
It's a huge question.
And maybe even more pointedly, what's one single action, even a small one? What action might actually have the most significant positive impact going forward? Something to think about.